Hey everyone, Jay here. I'm still on my break writing my book, Progress Behind Me. But in the meantime, as I said, I'm going to keep releasing older episodes or some of my favorite episodes or suddenly relevant episodes from the archive of Dilemma. And this one is one that I think about all the time, and something recently happened to me that had me thinking about it a lot. I actually think about it a lot. It's hard to pick favorites from my archive, but this one might take the top spot. But so recently, last week, there was a massive power outage in all of Spain, where I am, and I think it also included Portugal and parts of France. I happened to be one of the lucky ones who was in an elevator at the time that it hit, alone by myself, small elevator, so it was just suddenly pitch black, dark, silence. I was able to kind of, bang on the door and alert some neighbors of my presence there. Eventually, they were able to get in touch and reach somehow the mechanic of the elevator company who was able to come release me. All in all, I was in there for about 3 hours. And then when I finally did get out, it was one of those, I kind of like these days, but those fun days where things are just a little different. None of the cell phones had service, obviously. All the traffic lights were out, and people were out. Kids were playing. Dogs seemed really happy. Maybe their owners were paying attention to them in a new way for the first time in a while. It was also a beautiful day weather-wise, which doesn't hurt anything. So my wife and I just walked all over the city. And when the power did come back on late in the evening, we could kind of see the traffic lights one by one coming back on. And we would just see all of the necks just suddenly simultaneously crane back to their phones and continue. I admit, sort of a little dip in my heart when it happened. But I think you'll see why this conversation had me thinking about both of those experiences, the weird kind of solitude in a dark room alone with my thoughts, and the day that was kind of weird without cell phone usage. So the conversation is with Benjamin Storey. He wrote this book along with his wife, actually, Jenna Silber Storey. It's called Why We Are Restless. I took off the cover at some point. I do that a lot. It's an incredible book. In this episode, I released the episode with our conversation under the title Our Modern Disquiet. And I'm pretty sure it's the one that I share the most with people who are interested with what I do. And I know it's the one that people tell me that they share the most with their friends in my entire archive. So I think you're really going to love it. You're soon going to see why that day made me think of it quite a bit, Why We Are Restless. Also then, just a quick personal update. I'm going to be at the How the Light Gets In festival, which is at the end of this month in May in Hay-on-Wye in the United Kingdom. It's a music and philosophy festival that looks awesome. I've always wanted to go. This year I'm going, and I'm also lucky enough to be hosting 2 events there. So I'm hosting a debate on the question of if science has become the new religion. Should be really interesting, gets kind of to the deepest existential questions that I love. And then the other one is a debate on the crisis in the academy, which might end up getting a little spicy. It's about ideological capture and whether the academy is up to the challenge of the modern world and our politics and everything else. So it should be really fun. Both of my events are on the last day of the festival, but I'll be there for the entire time. So if you happen to be going and you find me, say hi. If not, I'll certainly let you know about when those 2 events that I host are available online or anything else interesting that I see, because I think it's going to be a cool festival. So that's it for me for now. Enjoy this episode. I know you will. Benjamin Storey. I called it Our Modern Disquiet, so enjoy. Restlessness. I think there are 3 ways to think about this concept to keep in mind during this conversation. Here's the first way. I'll call it a little kind of restlessness. You know that sense that you just kind of can't sit still? That if you were placed in a room and asked to just sit there for a while, you'd instinctively reach for your phone and check something. Anything. Social media, sure, but text messages that you've already read, the weather that you don't actually care about, the news, the stock market, that random thought you just had about what the original Smokey Bear logo design looked like and how it evolved over the years, or what the name of that Smashing Pumpkins' second album was, or anything. The point is, we all know that feeling of restlessness in the year 2021. Of course we do. And the phone you're imagining sure makes it easier to feel this kind of restlessness. But even if the Wi-Fi was down, you'd probably still fire up that old gem matching game on your phone that you don't even like that much. Maybe you already have one or several of those apps open while you're listening to me right now. And we're only a minute in. It's okay, don't feel bad. The point is, that's a brand of restlessness that we're talking about here. There's also a restlessness about what to be in life. Should you stick with your current job? Should you try something new?
Which of the 7 creative projects that you've started and paused and promised yourself that you'd see through should you pursue further? Which should you drop? Why not try violin or rock climbing or painting? Maybe you should try your hand at graphic design. That kind of restlessness that resists the steady focus on creative endeavors is another restlessness we're talking about. And the last kind of restlessness is a bigger kind, a deeper kind. That's that feeling that you have where you really want to know the answers to the big questions in life, like, is there really a God? Is there any kind of consciousness after death? What's the best way to live? Is there an objective form of morality? What's on the other side of that faraway mountain? This is a kind of philosophical and existential restlessness that runs through our veins and has long before social media or smartphones, of course. And you just won't be content with eternal ignorance on these issues. So these 3 forms of restlessness have a strange interplay, of course. One of them might antagonize or swamp out another, and an overdose on any of them can be a recipe for madness, depression, or war. Benjamin Storey traces a kind of wrestling match revolving around this concept of restlessness over a few centuries in the work of 4 famous French thinkers: Montaigne, Pascal, Rousseau, and Tocqueville, in that order. You're going to get a flavor of each of them here, I hope, but what I hope you'll also hear is how the philosophies these 4 men laid out run right through our modern condition, and they all show up in our politics, our loneliness, our meditation retreats, our video game addictions, our fanaticism, our religious devotions, and most importantly, in that nagging, unspeakable, mysterious disquiet and angst that many of us are feeling, even while the steady beat of progress shows up in many undeniable pieces of data around us. I think you'll hear the echoes of well-known clashes of modern personalities of philosophy and psychology, some of whom we name directly. I'm also certain you will hear a stance represented by one or more of the 4 thinkers that you feel an affinity for, and likewise, you'll hear something that you really don't like. We tend to categorize thinkers into certain camps and schools of thought drawn along fault lines. These 4 thinkers are really good representatives for you to know, particularly Montaigne and Pascal, who diverge starkly in some important ways. There's a fun kind of, which character in the cast are you like magazine quality to some of this that I think you'll really enjoy. So my Twitter thing. I mentioned how the small form of our restlessness might actually drown out and distract from what I would call a better form of our deeper existential restlessness. That's what I felt like my Twitter habit was doing to me. In this episode, I call myself a sort of atheistic Pascalian. Don't worry, I'll explain that. But the short version of it is an effort to fall in love with big, deep, existential questions. It's a kind of restlessness to be haunted by those questions, but I endorse an attempt to experience it as a sort of beautiful torment. But the little kind of restlessness, that distraction, that eroding focus and addiction to ambition and attraction to distraction has a way of ensnaring me and diverting me from that path. I'm borrowing those phrases from Storey, addiction to ambition and attraction to distraction. You'll soon hear him use them better than I just did. He's a fantastic teacher and professor, and I think that comes through here. Getting to listen to someone like that is really one of the best joys in life. So, close that internet search on the original Smokey Bear logos, close the gem matching games, and listen in. This episode is about you and me and us and that deep disquiet that we can't quite express. I'm calling this a little mini season between 2 and 3. I have a few more to push out over the winter, and I'll be back at the end of the conversation to wrap it up and hint at what I'm up to these days and where to find me. So here you go, Benjamin Storey, that modern disquiet. Enjoy. I loved your book. I really, really, really did. I have a lot of questions about the title, and I know you've gotten a lot of questions about the title and this word restlessness, and I want to start there, but I want to forecast this before we go through this because your book lays out 4 thinkers in order, and you sort of situate them in this thread of a conversation through what you're calling restlessness. We're going to get into there. It's Montaigne, followed by Pascal, followed by Rousseau, followed by Tocqueville. And we're gonna get that. I hope the viewer gets a bit of the flavor of each of the 4. But there's one part of this incredible book that you wrote that I didn't like or I felt dissatisfied with, and it's the end, because it's literally just like 4 pages of you and your wife, your co-author, kind of putting your own thoughts in it, and I want so much more of that. So as we go through this conversation, I'm going to keep trying to drag you, not the historian, not the philosopher, but the man Benjamin Storey, into like, what do you think? How does all of this map on to today? So I want to keep trying to drag it back from what I think some people can almost get turned off by, of like historical, these dead men talking about things. But what you were trying to do with this, and what I think is successful ultimately, is pinning it into today. But let's start with the title.
Sure.
The title is Why We Are Restless, which is usually like the second question. It presumes that, well, we are restless, and so the second question is, why are we restless? But let's back up to the first one. Are we restless? What does that mean? Prove it to me first somehow.
Thanks for the question. And the word restless, the French word is inquiétude, disquiet. It might be a more literal translation for that. It's an idea with a very long history. You could trace it back to antiquity. You could talk about St. Augustine saying, our hearts are restless until they rest in God. And so in a certain sense, this is a really old thing. But in another sense, I think this is a very modern and contemporary phenomenon that I think many of us can observe in ourselves. And so I think all of us have the experience of having a hard time paying attention to the things that are right in front of our faces and preferring instead to surf around on the internet to see what's going on in our text messages. We have this experience of a very intense kind of, or not intense, actually, intense is the wrong word for it. Right. This experience of a constant attraction to distraction. And that was I think that constant attraction to distraction is what we got really interested in thinking about this book. So this is something that we saw in our students, something that we saw in ourselves, and something that we then learned from our reading really has a history. And so we thought thinking through that history could be useful to other people. And so that's why we wrote the book.
Yeah, perfect. So I'm sold on it. It's like the word disquiet. Obviously, it was a facetious question. I feel it too, right? It's this thing that we kind of have the sense that it's like an undertow. You're right. Intense is the wrong word. It's just this current that a lot of people are feeling, and maybe in particular men, I think, are feeling a different brand of it. And maybe we could talk about that later, or young men for various reasons. But there's just something, we're told progress is happening and the graphs are going in the right direction. Not talking about the COVID ones generally there, but the sort of like wealth and health of the global sort of neoliberal enterprise.
The Steven Pinker graphs, yes.
The Steven Pinker graphs,
right.
Yes. I once threw that at him as a moderator on stage with him. I deemed them the Pinker graphs, but yes, right. Like, generally, progress is happening. It would be hard-pressed by the Pinker graph sort of metrics to say that the neoliberal project of a globalized economy and thus politics or whatever, in some degree, is working. But it's getting harder and harder maybe to feel that on an individual level, and something just feels like it's sort of off or missing. So restlessness... Every chapter I read in your book, I was like, that can't be the right word, but I couldn't think of a better one. And it might just be one of those that like, there's a different word, or maybe we need to invent one about this thing that we're feeling. But to your point, let's jump into Montaigne where you start, because what was so crucial about it is it's not new. None of this is new. And you showing me, in particular, reading this, that existential emptiness or hollowness or nagging kind of there must be something more thing about us is of course an ancient conversation, but then starting your conversation in the 1500s with Montaigne makes sense. Well, tell me why you started it there, because you could have started this with Muhammad and Jesus and made it like, any other kind of like what's the meaning of life book. Why start it in the 1500s?
That's a great question. I think it's intimately related to your last question about the specific sorts of things that we experience now. And we wanted to start with Montaigne because Montaigne is a figure at the center of an experience that I think rests in the back of the modern mind. I think something that we don't often return to explicitly, but that kind of haunts us, which is the experience of religious war. All of us know that our political orders were born out of the experience of religious war, and all of us know that we don't want to go back. And Montaigne is somebody who experienced religious war directly. He lived in the second half of the 16th century in France, and France had particularly nasty three-way wars of religion, and those wars of religion touched Montaigne directly. He had friends...
These were Catholics and Protestants and Huguenots, and
So it's ultramontanist Catholics, the extreme Catholic faction, Huguenots, and then Montaigne is in this kind of middle faction that's kind of loyal to the monarchy, but he's always kind of, he's not intensely loyal to the monarchy. He doesn't actually think a king like Charles IX is any good, but it's just the position that he thinks is most moderate and needs to be held in his particular time. So Montaigne is in the middle of all this, and he lays out a kind of argumentative strategy for his readers that he thinks can calm down the violent religious passions of his age. And that strategy has two parts. The first is an argument for skepticism. Montaigne has this long and wonderful essay called The Apology for Raymond Sebond, in which he does a kind of stream of consciousness history of philosophy. And he can walk through all of the history of Western philosophy up to his time with a kind of nonchalance, which is one of his great attributes. And he shows us the arguments that people have been having about the good life over the course of millennia. And he says to us, nobody's come up with a consensus answer. There are all these different views of this, and people have been arguing about this and now fighting about it for all this time, and they haven't settled on anything. And so Montaigne says, we can just give up on these kinds of existential questions. And instead, we can seek our happiness without answering this question, which is a kind of paradoxical thing, but that's what he tries to do. Instead of saying, what's the highest good? What should I seek? What should I bet my life on? He says, I'm not going to bet my life on anything. I'm just going to kind of dabble my way to happiness. I'm going to do a little of this and a little of that. And that's a formula that I think all of us can find operating in our own lives. We're very reluctant to say, I'm going to be a college professor or a stay-at-home mom or an investment banker, and I'm going to go all in on that, and I'm not going to care about anything else because I think that's the way to happiness. Instead, we try to hedge our bets, but I think that constant trying to hedge our bets begets what is, I think, what we call restlessness, but I think is often referred to by the phrase fear of missing out. I think we are constantly haunted by the fear of missing out because we haven't really thought through the alternatives on the question of how to live.
Yeah, but to stay with the charm of Montaigne before we start to criticize him, of course, you wrote it very skillfully that you made all four of the philosophers attractive in the right way, even while forecasting, like, of course, there's some holes in this. But the Montaigne, I think you wrote, I think you're quoting him there of his just very famous, like, when I dance, I dance, when I eat, I eat.
Yeah.
It's like, I'm just there, right? And you coined this thing for him of imminent contentment. Is this, there's some modern equivalents, which I think you actually said he was somewhat like the founder accidentally of what we call mindfulness or flow states, or just, like, just be there, dude. Just dance and chill and, like, stop asking, like, what the meaning of life is and just enjoy the garden that you're in right now.
So Montaigne has this great line about death. And remember, this is a guy, death is all around him. And he says, I want death to find me planting my cabbages, but nonchalant about death, and still more about my unfinished garden. It's just a fantastic line, and it really encapsulates this ability to be in the moment, to be where one is, and not concerned. You can be gardening without even being concerned about the perfection of your garden. These cabbages of Montaigne's, they're a theme, and he's an immensely charming writer who uses lots of humble stuff like cabbages. And this is worth telling a little story about. So I was reading Montaigne with first year students a few years ago, and they showed up to class one day, about 15 of them, all of them in rough collars like Montaigne, and all of them with cabbages in their hands, which is just a beautiful expression of how much this guy had gotten to them. And so, Montaigne's ability to charm us with the sense that, look, there's lots that's wonderful about existence just as we find it. We don't need to try so hard. That mere life, as he puts it, can be the good life. I think that's the picture of Montaigne, and I think it's a picture that's proven immensely attractive to millions of people for very good reasons.
Yeah, it's if you swapped out the ruffled collars for maybe like a Nirvana shirt and cabbages for weed, then you have my picture. Right? And it's like, so before we move on to the obvious sort of criticisms, or where people are probably already sensing the is that really happiness, or is that possible stuff, which you hid successfully in the chapter and waited to like throw in the form of Pascal. But before we go there, what would try to bring Montaigne to today? What would he be looking at and criticizing when he sees someone playing on their phone or swiping Instagram and endlessly? Would he actually find fault with this as distraction, or is he like, yeah, dude, like that's your thing? Because before you answered, another attractive thing about God and Christianity is going to come up a lot in all these conversations. He went to church and did his thing, but he did it like ironically and just as nonchalant as everything else, being like, well, I'm a Frenchman in the 1500s, so of course I'm going to church because that's just what we do. I don't believe any of it. Doesn't matter if I do. It doesn't matter if you do. Who cares? But like, it's what I do. If I go to India, I'll find someone doing what they do there. Just like, do you, dude? Be me, and I'm going here. So he was like an ironic atheist in a weird way. But yeah,
good. Good. Well, the interesting thing there is the way that you put this is that on the one hand, it's you do you. On the other hand, there's a lot of external social conformity. It's not like because I'm doing me, therefore I have to like blow up the church. It's like I'll go, whatever. But that's just not the fort intérieur, the interior court, the heart, where his life really lives. And Montaigne puts that life on the page for us in his essays. And so, Montaigne is not really going to bother anybody about a kind of harmless form of amusing oneself. Insofar as these things are harmless, he doesn't. That's the point: is to make a life out of experiences like this. Now, he thinks there may be some better ways to do it. Gardening might be a little bit more satisfying than web surfing. However, he's really not that judgmental a guy. What he might be harsh on is some of the revivals of fanaticism that we might be seeing around us. And there, he could make his case for skepticism again. He would be willing to remind people, we know a whole lot less than we think we do. What all of us should know is that we have ample reasons to doubt and be unsure of our own convictions. So those might be, two things that Montaigne would point us to.
If we're pointing to Montaigne as a reaction to the religious wars around him, and to simplify it too much, to people taking the big questions of life way too seriously, to the point of slitting each other's throats over like the differences of whether the cracker is really Jesus or not. they just small differences they end up killing each other over because they think they're that meaningful, and he's reacting to that. And obviously it's attractive, and it caught a wave. But if we placed him in now, if we put him in a time machine and put him in the year 2021, when religious wars certainly are happening in certain parts of the world, but let's put him in North Carolina, where I am right now, is he just a counterweight to the time he was in, or did he truly believe that was some sort of eternal advice column that would still hold up today? Is kind of what I'm asking. And that might be an inescapable problem for all philosophers. We're imprisoned by the time we're in, and we have to react to it to a certain degree. And maybe he's okay with that, being like, oh, well, now I'm in the year 2021, so what I do now as a philosopher is tell you to take it more seriously.
Well, that's really interesting.
Slippery.
Right? On the one hand, I think I'm with you, and that Montaigne would be with you, in the sense that the notion of a perennial philosophy, in the sense that, like, look, here are the principles of the good life and the good society. We can draw a deduction from these things and map it all out, and it would be the same in all times and places. I don't think that's right. And I don't think Montaigne would think it was right. I think he would look at circumstances and say, there's an old teacher's mantra, begin where the students are. The students are different places in different times. Societies are at different places in different times, and they need to lean in different directions. So I think all that is true. I think we could be fairly confident that Montaigne would say something different were he with us now. At the same time, I think his skepticism, I think that is fundamental to him. I think this is something that he deeply believes. Now, whether that would entail the same kind of strategy such as you and I were talking about a second ago, the sort of outward conformity, inward irony of his attitude toward church going or politics, I don't know if that's what Montaigne would think now. But I tend to think that those things would be more contingent than his fundamental meditations on what human beings can know.
Right. Okay, so before we move to Pascal, can you give me sort of a modern Montaigne? Is it like a beatnik? Are we talking like Jack Kerouac of just drop in, tune out, whatever that is?
There's so many American phrases that catch this really nicely. Part of me thinks of like the Fonz, just like taking it easy. The presence of cool all over American life. The ideal of cool is something that we really look up to. But a lot of our ideals of cool are edgier and more, I'm thinking of Miles Davis, or harsher. I'm thinking of Clint Eastwood, so they have that kind. And Montaigne's cool is in a way purer, right? He's more truly nonchalant.
I have one for you.
Yeah.
Lebowski's Dude. It's the dude from Lebowski, right? Is that as close as I can get?
Your pop culture references may be better than mine.
Come on. Well, hopefully the reader.
Well, I'm sure your listeners know, but from what I've heard about the dude from The Big Lebowski, you're right.
Have you not seen The Big Lebowski? Come on. Now this is going to turn into an intervention that Benjamin Storey needs to watch The Big Lebowski with his philosophy class.
Right. This is. I'm getting to be like one of my professors who is still using Tina Turner references in the early 2000s. But I confess this is my fate. So there we are.
Okay. All right. So homework for you, Big Lebowski. Okay, let's move to Pascal. So Montaigne comes out of the religious wars, is this reminder to not take things too seriously, to like chill out a bit. It catches a wave. But Pascal comes along, and there's a 3-word phrase, I'll let you say it, that he sort of pops the balloon of this very attractive and charming, lighthearted way of living, where Pascal doubts that this is genuinely possible. Is that the right way to put it? What's the phrase? And then let's go to Pascal.
The phrase is l'homme passe l'homme, which means man surpasses man, man transcends man. So the whole point of the Montaignian project is, look, if I just lower my sights a little bit, if I just don't expect too much, I can make myself into a kind of whole. I can be sufficient unto myself by not expecting too much from things. And Pascal says human beings are both greater and more miserable than Montaigne imagines. That is, there's a kind of internal amplitude and longing that is found in the human heart that simply cannot be solved by this kind of psychological stratagem. So that's really the fundamental dynamic that operates in the book that we've written, is this argument between Montaigne and Pascal, whether we can make ourselves whole or whether wholeness is really the wrong standard for a human being, whether that's impossible for beings made like we are. And so that's the basic Pascalian objection to the whole Montaignian thing.
To like simplify it or dumb it down, I mean, he doubts that Montaigne could truly be only worried about his cabbages and really forget about something as profound as death. Or does God really exist? Or what is the right thing to do? These big existential questions that, while they may be fundamentally impossible to answer, and we might be doomed to the misery of eternal question asking and not answering them, Pascal says they're inescapable, and the human condition is that we must ask them. And to that point, to be truly man is to not deny this aspect of us, but to try to lean into it.
That's
so. How did he do this?
That's exactly right. And I think one of the things that you might say, Pascal was raised by a father who was like marked by Montaigne and sort of tried to give him a kind of Montaignean homeschoolish sort of education. It's a really kind of a beautiful thing. And so he was very much a part of this class, a part of the world that was the wave that you were describing earlier that Montaigne caught, that class of people who were really influenced by this. So he knew it from the inside. And he might point to things, that my students notice when we're reading Montaigne is like, well, like Montaigne keeps telling us to chill out, but he was an awfully ambitious guy. He published his book, he got it printed and he stuck it in the saddlebags and he rode off to the court in Paris and he gave a copy to the king. Is this guy really so nonchalant as he pretends to be? And I think that's a real question that one can ask of Montaigne. One could say this book described a whole new way of thinking about human life, and even if the center of that way of thinking about human life is a kind of existential indifference, nonetheless it's an ambitious project to do that, and Montaigne was engaged in this kind of an ambitious project. So I think that's something of what Pascal's objection to Montaigne would be. To the other part of your question, how did he do this? I want to take a second just to describe who Pascal is, which it blows me away every single time I think about it. This is a man who died at the age of 39. And by the time he reached the age of 39, he'd made world historical contributions in an incredible number of fields. So he has this treatise on conic sections. They have a problem of geometry. He solved this problem called the cycloid, which is another major geometric mystery that was a significant accomplishment to work through. He's the father of what's called Pascal's triangle, which is this arithmetic sequence that a lot of people encountered in high school, and which is the basis of modern probability theory. He discovered the phenomenon of atmospheric pressure, and to this day, the units of pressure are called pascals. He also invented the world's first working calculator, that could do math of up to 8 digits. Then he jumped into literary and theological controversy, writing one of the greatest bestsellers of the Ancien Régime, which is called the Provincial Letters. Then he writes the Pensée, which is this great work of Christian apologetics, which is really at the heart of our book. And then at the end of his life, he invented the world's first transportation system, the world's first public transportation system, these 5-cent carriages that he and a friend made for Paris. And so the really interesting thing about Pascal is he has the credentials of a truly first-order modern mind, right? If modernity is about the improvement of man's estate by things like refinements in science, really a new direction to science, through technological innovations, like through this unprecedented kind of philanthropy, Pascal is that guy. And he says, nonetheless, that immanent contentment, which is the phrase that we give to Montaignean contentment. And immanent contentment is a kind of contentment that is made possible by a modern world like ours that makes so many of us so much more prosperous than we'd ever had the chance to be before, so much freer than we'd ever had the chance to be before. And those are good things. But Pascal looks at this and he looks at people enjoying this around them and he says, guys, it's not enough. And you know it's not enough if you're honest with yourselves. Right. So that's the Pascalian thing in a nutshell.
Yeah, he writes about, well, by the way, I'm 39 as well, and I tied my shoes this morning. So
I'm glad you're still with us.
Yes, I'm halfway there with to Pascal's achievements. Or at least the way you write about him and quote him, he writes with almost a really deep, almost like not self-hatred, but almost. I mean, like a deep shame and guilt or something about that we at some point we really are jealous of our friends. We don't love them. We actually have these dark edges to us. He would call bullshit on Montaigne, basically being like, oh, you're so nonchalant about that success that your cousin just had, but really there's this pit in your soul that burns with envy of his car or whatever. I mean, it's almost like self-flagellating picture of ourselves. But I have to admit, reading it, I don't know if I just share some of that, it rang much truer for me. And I was waiting for it while reading the Montaigne stuff to be like, come on, dude, like people aren't just little butterflies on the inside, and I'm not. And so, at least Pascal could rescue that and point to that in myself, and assuage it a little bit.
My experience is very akin to yours, but it has an interesting inflection over time, which is that I was instructed to read Pascal when I was a graduate student by somebody in a position of authority. And I started to, and I hated it so much that I physically threw the book across the room and vowed that I would never touch it again.
Wow.
And the reason I hated it was because I wanted to be happy. And Pascal was telling me that I couldn't do that. And
He hit a little too close to home, clearly. Right?
That's exactly what he did. And so I set the book aside for 10 years. And I came back to it after having experienced a little bit more of life, and in fact also having seen some tougher stuff about myself, some tougher stuff about other people, but also, and I think this is the most important part, witnessing how much suffering is an ordinary part of adult life. That was decisive for me, that I saw that there was lots of suffering in the world and that it was unfair, that I had friends who went through awful things, who I knew to be better people than me. That was awful. And Pascal was honest about the fact that we're not happy. And we've got significant reason to not be happy. And this woke me up. And so, what I find when teaching Pascal to students is, he says, he's got this formula. The reason human beings are so unhappy is because they cannot sit alone in their rooms, that we're always running away from ourselves. So this is a Pascalian examination of distraction. And he says, why can't we sit alone in our rooms? And it's because of this disproportion that he finds within us. We want to be happy, we find lots of sadness. We want life, we get death. We want knowledge, we get ignorance. And we can't help wanting those things. You can't stop wanting life and happiness and knowledge, but you can't get them. And that's just the reality of how we're made. And so Pascal thinks that sadness is the natural human condition. Sadness is normal. And when I've been talking about students with this over the years, I always feel like when they read these lines from Pascal, when we talk about these things in conversation, somebody is finally telling the truth that they themselves have experienced, but that you just can't acknowledge in a world in which happiness signaling is a sort of requirement for social success.
You described your friends who've gone through terrible things, and people, I'm sure, could fill in the blanks with all kinds of awful things that they've seen in their lives, and obviously bad things. But what's also interesting to weave into that, what's maybe more universal as an experience, is more of what we would call like the first world problems, where take out the death of a loved one, that's an obviously sort of terrible thing that no one deserves but happens anyway. But just the everything is kind of fine and taken care of, but you're still a little bit miserable, which that's the more unspeakable thing in a society that tells you, but we gave you everything. You have a car, you have a wife, you have a house, you have this, you have all this stuff. Why are you miserable? And he's got a very clear answer of well, there's a horizon over there, and there's answers over it. And every time I go over the horizon, there's another one, and I can't stop thinking about it. I can't stop going towards it. I can't be happy here.
Good. So there's this, I have to bring up a line from Alexis de Tocqueville here, who read Pascal every day. That was one of his closest companions. His friend, Gustave de Beaumont, said Pascal and Tocqueville, they were souls made for each other. I love that line. Tocqueville came to the United States in the 1830s. He looks around, and he says, there's never been a country in which so many people were so well off and so free in the world. And he knows all the evils of American society, and he writes about those very extensively. He just nonetheless thinks, if you look at world history, you're just not going to find as large a middle class, as many people as free and as prosperous as you do right here. And he says, but they're not happy. He says that there's a kind of cloud hanging over their features all the time. The place that my wife and I have seen this most prominently is on college campuses. Colleges, American colleges, are a wonderful thing. Anybody who has been to university campuses elsewhere in the world will recognize Americans are peculiar. We pour tremendous amounts of money into this. We love them. We identify with them. We wear their T-shirts. We are deeply invested in these places, and they're amazing, right? The campus where I teach, it's a country club. It's got a great chef. You get these nice classes. There's a gym. It's in the mountains. It's fabulous. But talk to students, and they're just obviously unhappy. And the higher you go up the social scale, the worse it gets. Mm-hmm. And so this is the thing that's so striking. Well, one of the things that Tocqueville notices is that this inquietude that exists in the middle of prosperity, when you have everything taken care of. This is an old phenomenon. He had seen it among aristocrats. Aristocrats, they're hanging out in the drawing room. Everything's very comfortable. They've got a chateau and so on and so forth. And they're miserable, and they're making other people miserable. So that phenomenon is as old as the world. What Tocqueville says was distinctive about a democratic society is that it's experienced by so many people. And so the very fact that we are as good as we are at helping people rise in their material standards of living and their freedom is in some ways connected to this disquiet that so many of us feel.
So Pascal's answer to this quandary, I think, I don't want to make it too sort of trite, but is the insistence of, let's call it, the utility of a Christian God. And it doesn't, I don't even know if it necessarily needs to be a Christian one. You could clear that up for me.
Yeah.
But let's say necessary cosmic objective as a God could be objective responsibilities of ours. And maybe the insistence of a moral code, that an anarchic system of humans just is not good enough, maybe. Not even just to lead to our happiness, but also just to maintain society, as it were. And this is the part of, I would consider myself, after reading it, as sort of like atheistic Pascalian. I had a previous episode in season 2 called The Atheistic Search for God, and this was the way I wanted to use the term God, that it is the eternal horizon that you have to go toward. I don't doubt any of that of Pascal, but I have to admit, of course, that I find his answer, and again, you could clear this up because I think Christian apologetics may have twisted Pascal in a way of made him more sure of his Christianity than maybe he was, or the truth claims of it rather than its utility. But yeah, like, square that circle and walk that balance beam for me.
Yeah.
I'm thinking, again, for a modern equivalent, a Jordan Peterson type character. I don't know if you know his philosophies a bit, but he's very coy about how the truth claims of Christianity really hold up.
Right.
But he certainly is a defender of its pragmatism for all kinds of reasons that feel very Pascalian to me.
Okay, great. Pascal does not think that he can argue you into Christian belief. He is interested in doing something different, which is, he says there are 3 states of human life. There are those who are neither searching for nor have found God. There's those who haven't found God but are looking for him. And there are those who have found God and are happy with that. And Pascal is trying to move people who aren't looking to the state of people who are looking. And he calls that second state the state of seeking in anguish. So what he's trying to do is just hold up a mirror to us and say to us, look, the anguish is there. You are unhappy and anguished. And this, you don't need faith to demonstrate. This is simply a matter of anthropology, of psychological self-observation. This is something you can just see about yourself if you observe your behavior closely. So that's part of what Pascal thinks he can do, is move people from religious indifference, which is really just sort of covering over the facts that we know, such as the fact that we're going to die, to a position of religious seeking. Now, if he gets us into the position of religious seeking, he understands that we may have rational objections, and he tries to clear some of those up. But he doesn't think that he or any other human being can do the work of religious finding. Pascal thinks God is a person. What it means to say that God is a person is that God is capable of action, that God is capable of presence. And Pascal thinks that some people seek God and some people find him. In other words, God shows up. There he is. And Pascal seems to think that he had this experience. In November of 1654, this famous fragment called the Memorial that he carried around in his vest pocket for the rest of his life. And he describes this experience as very interesting. He says, his experience of God is not the God of the philosopher. It's not a rationalist God. It's not something you could prove. He thinks rationalist proofs of God are useless. It's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Personal names. Right? Like, think of Jacob in the desert wrestling with God in the middle of the night. That's what he thinks the God of the Bible is all about. In this sense, I would say it's different than Peterson. I think what Peterson is arguing for is you need some order in your life. Right. And I myself happen to think you need some order in your life. I tend to turn to classical sources for this kind of thing. But it's important to make the distinction that, Pascal says Christianity is as distant from deism as it is from atheism. It's radically distinct from something like deism. It's not something that you can come up with rationally. It's the intervention of a personal God in history. That is ultimately between you and God. And Pascal can try to help get stuff out of the way. That's the most he can do.
Yeah. I want to pause our historical trek here and do that thing I forecast in the beginning, and you started to do it. Can we talk as just you and I now about that part of Pascal? Because I think this is fascinating.
Yeah.
And Rousseau and Tocqueville are coming up, which are two other really interesting, almost experimenters with the first two thinkers in the book. But Pascal and Montaigne are your stars. Like, that sets the stage, and we're on it right now. What do you think about all that? And I want to try to weave a needle here, because I like what you said about we need order and we need some kind of responsibility. I think to diagnose a lot of our current social ills and anger and partisan politics, a lot of it, when you dig under it, you find this old conversation between Pascal and Montaigne. I don't know if you do.
Yeah.
Clearly you wrote the book, so I'm sure you see it. I'm seeing it everywhere now, of this conversation about order versus nonchalance. And let me pin something there, and then I have a specific question for you. But with pinning that, I'm convinced that most of our political sort of noise we're making is really just symptoms of much deeper philosophical and really, really good philosophical differences. These old, wonderful existential debates about the meaning of God and man and nature, that's what we're actually fighting about. But it just comes out as weird noise. Even something like the abortion debate. And I won't lay out my entire argument. It's something that's about to make a lot of headlines in America in December. The Supreme Court's doing a big case. But what's under all of this is I'm convinced, is these very old conversations about philosophy, about something like, ought we engineer a world in which we are able to get out of the responsibility and consequences of our actions.
Yeah.
Religious people would call them sins, right? And this is at heart a lot of, I think, conservative resistance to something like stem cell research or abortion or all kinds of things, is really the resistance of a fear of a world in which we are not held responsible. And that's, I think, what you and Pascal and maybe Peterson might suggest is the kind of order we need. Even if Peterson might be more of a skeptic than Pascal, it sounds, but even if you just make a pragmatic argument that you need a God in order to create this kind of order, I in my arguments with conservative philosophy, I always give them this robust defense in a purely secular sense that I don't doubt that. I, too, also concerned about what happens to us and our meaning in our lives if we successfully engineer ourselves out of a way to ever feel the responsibility for our actions, especially ones that we might be ashamed of or not proud of or might not be optimal somehow. You can answer that, but I wanted to ask you about, let's answer that before I ask you about one thing that I know you do to keep order in your life, so go on.
Sure. I would give you a philosophic answer rather than a religious answer to the question of order. In other words, I think that the argument that you're attributing to Jordan Peterson, the argument for the need for order, I think the best places to look for that argument are philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, and I've learned a ton from them about how to live. And philosophers like Plato and Aristotle are not believers in the Christian God, which they didn't know anything about. But I think they make moral, commonsensical arguments that we can get on the basis of observation of ourselves that tell us, look, if I let my desires rule my soul, I become less happy. You don't have to be Albert Einstein to understand this. I think this is something we can observe about ourselves. And so in this sense, I think with respect to the concern for moral order, this is a matter of self-knowledge that I think lots of people come to in various ways in their life, and it may have nothing to do with any sort of encounter with the classical philosophers. But the old adage, know thyself, is a very powerful thing. And I think people often see that, for example, you're describing a world in which we could somehow get rid of our own sense of moral responsibility. I think many of us have actually kind of tried that, right? Like, I'm just going to do what I want to do and I'm going to forget about it. It's awfully stubborn.
And maybe even worse than stubborn, it actually is. It's somehow an incomplete life, right? This I always go back to this line. It's like this throwaway line that someone told me in Mexico. This interior designer who was very French and very maybe it wasn't an accident. He was very French, and he came up with this line about the way he likes to design. And he said, "I want responsibility. I want freedom." Yeah. He said them right back to back. I want responsibility, I want freedom. And on first blush, the words responsibility and freedom almost seem like opposites. But they actually are so handcuffed together. Without responsibility is that freedom. And that's what I appreciate about Pascal, and I even appreciate about Peterson, although I bristle at a lot of his other philosophies and maybe his landing point. Same with Pascal. I would try to make a defense. I fully co-sign the first move of Pascal. Get people onto the anguish of seeking. Yeah. But if you can somehow, and this is the trick, and I would try to convince Pascal, like that anguish, there's a way to do alchemy on that anguish to make it actually, the most meaningful thing. It's a horror show to me to find God, because I doubt it from every kind of place, of philosophy, of logic, of like, well, why that God? You will never stop asking the question, why is there something rather than nothing? Mm-hmm. And making peace with that anguish is an oxymoron, but that's the human condition. And I'm not going to fool myself into thinking that I can escape that one. And so I will do the best I can with it. I mean, I'm fine staying there. I just don't know why Pascal had to take that final step, but I didn't have his vision in the desert, so I don't know.
Well, right. On the one hand, there's this thing, this experience that Pascal has. On the other hand, the reason Pascal follows the God of Nazareth is because Pascal describes us as great and miserable. And as thinking reeds, as he puts it, right? We're as fragile as a reed. We know that death is eventually going to crush us. It doesn't take much. He says it takes a drop of water, which is so poignant in the age of COVID, right? Because we know we can be killed by a droplet in the air. Mm. But then he says, but we can think the thought universe, right? And as far as we know, the universe doesn't ever think anything at all. And so we're like, our mind is like more capacious than the universe. And at the same time, we can be swatted like a fly. Yeah. That's the extremes of the human condition. And so what Pascal says is, what picture do you want of the human condition that is truer, more extreme, and has more pathos than the picture of a God who thinks so highly of man, who recognizes man's greatness so much that he becomes one of us, and at the same time that suffers the worst torment, the worst kind of death a human being could possibly suffer, or up there, the shameful death of a criminal. That's greatness and misery. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's why Pascal thinks we should think about that answer. We should read about that answer. We should knock on that door. Again, he doesn't think he can make somebody else show up on the other side of that door. That's mm-hmm. between the individual and God.
So I think that's a perfect transition to our next thinker is going to be Rousseau. But then also, because I think I could thread this needle, is I know you and your wife, who co-wrote the book with you, observe the Sabbath as a way to maybe experiment or borrow some of these ideas. So I'd love for you to talk about that, but almost in the tradition of Rousseau, who read Montaigne and Pascal and came out of this tradition and tried a lot of stuff. It's like the best way to put him.
No, it's Rousseau. That's a nice formulation of what we're trying to describe in that chapter, which is Rousseau is charmed by the naturalness of the Montaignean life. That's there's this great French literary critic Sainte-Beuve, who said that what Montaigne is all about is nature complete without grace. Nature complete without grace. That's a lovely formulation for the project of Montaigne. And so Rousseau is charmed by that. But then he looks at Pascal and says, yeah, but Pascal is right. Like, this is way too shallow for what human beings are really after. And so he tries to combine the two, Montaignean naturalness and Pascalian depth, and he has all these different ways of doing it. He tries a lot of stuff, as you put it a moment ago. Now, with respect to the Sabbath, this was so hard for us at first. I mean, like we 3 kids. My wife's on the tenure track now. I mean, busy people, and like I'm sure many of your listeners are. And we decided, like, we're going nuts. We're going to try this thing that was recommended by some old book somewhere, of stopping 1 day a week. And at first it was like breaking a horse. And now it's everybody's favorite day of the week. It's just we wouldn't give it up for the world.
What rules do you observe on it? Is it like full on, like Jewish style, no light switches? Like, how far do you?
No,
take
we don't go like full on.
persistence?
We don't do that. We don't work. Stay off of email. Spend time with the children. Then we go to mass. That's what this looks like for us. We do, we'll call our parents. We'll engage with our families. We'll spend time with friends. There's lots of stuff that we'll do on the Sabbath. But the point for us is that we're modern, ambitious people who need to be broken from their attraction, their addiction to their own ambitions. And the Sabbath is really important for us for that. And it's also important to give our kids liberation from their pressures, which, as anybody who's got young children knows, it's like watching my 15-year-old do homework till 9 at night. That's kind of that's a lot, and it's nice to give her a break from that too.
Yeah. So Rousseau seemed to find all of the things he tried. He put on these hats. He put on the Montaignian hat and lived this way. Then he took it off and tried the Pascalian hat. He became like an ultra citizen, meaning like a purely out of himself social creature, and then tried the other way. I don't know which order of a purely selfish creature. He tried everything, and he found them ultimately, philosophically, unstable at some point.
Yeah.
And therefore failed in some degree, because I want to stay, not to harp on the Sabbath and Pascal, but what I find, my criticism of where Pascal lands is the unstable nature that I find of don't look too hard at the details of the truth claims here, because then it's going to fall apart, and then you're going to be back in the misery and the anguish. And it still, to me, feels like a wizard behind the curtain that you just can't look through. It seems to me Rousseau couldn't help but look, and then they all fell apart at some point.
So I would dispute your characterization of the truth claims in Pascal, but let's talk about Rousseau. Okay. Rousseau conceives of our trouble in terms of dividedness. Each of us is both a social being and a selfish being. He suggested we could solve that problem of internal dividedness by going to the extreme. So it's just like you described. He wants to do the citizen, or let's put it this way, he celebrates the citizen thing, like, being wholeheartedly dedicated to your community. And lots of us are interested in this age in which, things like words like solidarity are coming back. And so that, that communitarian longing, that is something that just keeps coming back in the modern world, and for good reason, because lots of people feel very lonely. We see that concern with solidarity in Rousseau. The interesting thing is, that's one that he doesn't actually do. He sort of goes back sort of near Geneva at one point. He's from Geneva, which is one of the few like modern republics on his understanding. But he leaves when he's 16, and he never lives there again. And this is not, he can't really do that sort of life. But the solitary stuff he really tries. He tries to be happy unto himself at one point by literally living on an island. And he says, I was happy. But then there are all these little qualifiers, where he notices that, actually I wasn't quite as solitary as I kind of cracked things up to be, and there were discontents around this time of day. And so you start to see that Rousseau is aware that his own quest is kind of quixotic, that he's going after something that he doesn't really find. Nonetheless, the experiment is super fascinating, because I think so many of us are drawn to the notion that, like, if I just found real community, life would be good. or if I could just be my authentic self, I'd have no more troubles. Yeah. Nobody has tried that harder than Rousseau.
It's either join a cult or go sit on a mountain in Tibet, and one of the two is going to work. He also, I mean, in that first thing about solidarity, he also champions and writes about, dying in battle and giving yourself over to the state and these warriors which also retains a modern attraction, especially in our storytelling of, sacrificing yourself for the state and joining the military and becoming a warrior. It's seen, darkly in ISIS and in very perverse forms of it, where we have to admit the deep philosophical attraction of giving yourself over to a group and a higher cause that, you're a cog in that wheel. There's a kind of liberation of not having to worry about yourself and your own anxieties and fears anymore, and just do this one thing. This is your job, and you could be incredibly good at it. That's attractive. Yeah.
Rousseau has this great line. He says about a Roman, he wasn't Caius or Lucius, he was a Roman. And I think this is related to a remark of Tocqueville's that is just fantastic. He says, he's talking about pantheism, the sense that God is everywhere and in all things and sort of present all the time, that the world and God are kind of the same thing. And he says, although this idea destroys human individuality, or rather because it destroys human individuality, it will exert a powerful hold on the human mind in modern times. I think that because it destroys human individuality thing is really powerful, because I think what Tocqueville is telling us there, and I think this is exactly what you're capturing in your comments about things like ISIS, is that there's a big part of us that just hates being alone. The fact of our individuality, that is just it's an intense weight to bear. And so the notion of sort of being one with the group, of being neither Caius nor Lucius but a Roman, there's something really attractive about that to human beings who find their freedom, their reason, their self-consciousness, their solitude, who find those things really, really painful. And so Rousseau speaks to that. He tries to make it, he tries to cut off some of the rougher edges. When he's talking about Geneva, which is kind of his ideal state, he always takes, he always takes pain to note that, well, they did a lot of military training, but it was all for defense, Yeah. So he does a lot of work to keep true fanaticism out of the picture. But he's obviously speaking to that longing, which is not something that I think is ever going to go away.
Right. So let's go to Tocqueville, because it seems, just to pin where we are, we've got the Montaignean sort of humans are capable of this imminent contentment kind of state, and that's what they should strive for, a kind of nonchalance and laugh through life and dance. We've got the Pascalian view of like calling bullshit on that, of like, no, actually we're much darker than that. And hey, let me be fairer to Pascal, since you did raise the resistance, offering this story of a God that he finds rather beautiful, and in many ways it is. There's much worse stories than the Jesus story. It's if everybody had a little more humility and grace and whatever. There's also some bad parts of it, and we could talk about it, but it's not the worst story. One of my other favorite thinkers, Hannah Arendt, pulls out the emphasis of forgiveness in Christianity as being, a very, very useful thing, and we should probably spend more time looking at it. And then we have Rousseau, who gives credit to both of them. I think he probably looks at both thinkers and being like, you're both right, that's part of human nature, but neither is complete. Maybe they need each other. Maybe the imbalance is possible. In some ways, I don't know how he ended his journey, but he shrugs in some ways and gives up and influences a lot of political sort of movements that might lean more libertarian, of like, the best we can do is just have a system of error correction or something like that. But what did Tocqueville do? Because he comes in at an interesting point of your book. I'll tell me if I get it wrong. He really takes this conversation, and he was rich, right? He comes from like aristocracy. This guy is like cream of the crop in Europe, in what I think he recognized to be an old way of the world that was on its deathbed. Yeah. And he's the one who takes all these ideas and says, hey guys, like, we're done. Like, us aristocrats, like, this is over, and a new world is being born. And he was excited about it, eager about it, but then also cautioned us, and in a lot of ways has been our, a much better Nostradamus than Nostradamus himself for our modern sort of strife that we're in now. How'd I do?
Yeah, that's great. And you said one thing about Rousseau that I got to pick up on, which is somebody, Carol Bloom is her name, wrote a book a long time ago about Rousseau, and she pointed out that the generation of the French Revolution that learned so much from him was a generation at once sentimental and violent. I think that sense that those things that political fanaticism can have a kind of sentimental heart, that's something that's really worth us noticing. The going on in the world around us right now. It's just that combination of softness and cruelty is a really powerful thing. Now, on your Tocqueville stuff, so Tocqueville's this French aristocrat. He can trace his lineage back to the Battle of Hastings. That's an old French family. As you said, he says aristocracy is done. This is a big thing for him. Not only was his family this really old family, his family had suffered terribly in the French Revolution. His great-grandfather, whom he deeply admired, was sort of his model of a statesman, had been executed because he was the defense lawyer for Louis XVI. His own parents had gone to jail when they were 20 years old, and his father emerged with white hair. I mean, not because he was old, because he was been so terrified by the experience. And his mother emerged with a kind of nervous tic for the rest of her life. So it really shook his family. And most people of that social class were just going to say, the French Revolution, democracy is a terrible idea. It just results in terror. Enough. And that's not what Tocqueville says. So he's trying to do several different things in democracy in America. One is he goes to France. It's revolution, counter-revolution, revolution, counter-revolution. It's a mess. They can't get a stable democratic Republican order together. So he goes off to America to say, hey, look, if you look over there, these people have kind of got it together. Maybe there's some stuff we can learn. And so those political lessons were such that people called Tocqueville in France, they called him the American, because he was constantly suggesting American things in political debates. And he was an active politician, which is a point worth noting. The other thing that's really important about Tocqueville's book, and this is really in volume 2, is with the soul of an aristocrat, he looks at the democratic age and he says, no society enjoys all good things. Even though I agree that democracy is more just and that it's the wave of the future, just because it's overall better doesn't mean it's absolutely better or better in absolutely everything. So he says, what can the past still teach democratic peoples? Even a more radical formulation. What do democratic ages have to learn from aristocratic ages? Because he thinks they do have something to learn from aristocratic ages, and that in fact they need that knowledge to hold themselves together.
Yeah. So what is it? I mean, what can we learn? Because I'm like, and he foretold the kind of modern too much freedom will lead to too much misery.
Well, I think the first political lesson is a lesson about citizenship.
Yeah.
And so, Tocqueville was steeped in the European tradition that admired the citizens of Greece, the citizens of Rome, the kind of citizen who doesn't understand citizenship as a matter of enjoying private rights, but a matter of participating in public deliberation and choice making. In other words, direct self-governance. And Tocqueville says, look, in a big federal liberal country like the United States, you obviously can't do that in the public square. You can't get 330 million of us together to rule like this. But lots of us can have some experience of it in smaller domains of life. And so Tocqueville famously admires the town governments of New England. He would admire things like I've participated in it, the institutions of faculty self-governance at a university. I think lots of us have some experience of democratic self-government in that way. And
even like associations like biker clubs and just sporting groups, small associations, your ultimate frisbee league that you're a part of, like that's his bread and butter.
The guy who's my son's soccer coach, he's an impressive guy, but he like takes time. Like, I'm going to coach the soccer team, or the guy who puts together the ultimate frisbee league. I mean, what he points out to us.
I was actually in an ultimate frisbee league in high school. Just point of reference.
Did you organize? Did you organize?
No, my friend Aaron did, and he did an incredible job. Tocquevillian to the heart.
And so I bet you've been admiring Aaron the rest of your life, right? Because
it's one of his best qualities.
It's like when people organize things, when they found things, when they animate things, right? Think of the things that we have. All of us have parts of our lives that are kind of routine, right? Like, I have a job. It's a specific role in a specific organization, and if I die, they're going to replace me with another guy who can do this job, and so on and so forth. But there are other things that wouldn't exist if you didn't do it, like this podcast, and that is probably the thing in which you're most deeply invested, of which you're most deeply proud, and where you feel like your soul is most at work, right? I'm doing this thing that nobody does but me, and that is an essential activity to my life. Tocqueville wants us to seek our happiness through these forms of civic, political, other kinds of engagement, to understand that happiness is an activity. It's an old Aristotelian phrase that I think is super useful. Happiness is not sitting on the couch with your Ben & Jerry's and your Netflix. Everybody knows this in a certain sense. But I think we don't often think enough about what kinds of activities do human beings actually enjoy. And they're not often, I think, lazy activities. They're activities that put our powers to work to the utmost degree. And some of those activities are political. And so that's one of the things that Tocqueville brings back, that he thinks this is kind of a remnant of the aristocratic world. He thinks the democratic world could learn from.
So what went wrong here? Let's bring Tocqueville to 2021. And what would his sort of assessment, assuming that he wasn't a fan of the state we're in, what would he assess someone who's very well read? He's a great way to finish your book, of course, because he comes after Pascal and Montaigne. What years was he writing this? Let me try to get it right.
So 1830. So he visited the United States 1831, I want to say, 1830 to 31. Published his first volume in 1835, second volume 1840.
Right. So he's been lucky enough to know all these thinkers that you've introduced us to. He was rich enough and had leisure enough time as an aristocrat to read all of them and get educated in a certain way. So let's bring him here. And what would he say? What do we need? What's going wrong? What's going right? And it's very specifically American. He was such a fan of this place. Yeah. I hope he wouldn't be too heartbroken to see the state of it.
Well, he'd be miffed, but I think there's a couple of things. One of them is very famous, and one of them is less famous. The famous one is Tocqueville is worried about the conjunction between individualism and what he calls soft despotism. That is, he sees that the pressures of modern life are going to cause people to shrink, that we're going to go back inside of ourselves. That, in other words, like, I'm busy, you're busy, and the tendency is going to be, I'm going to ignore stuff like public engagement because I've got other things to do, like driving carpool. And so I have to concentrate on the things that I have to do that are right in front of my face. This causes me to kind of come back into myself, to shrink. And that force is what Tocqueville calls individualism. So what he was worried about was that as individuals shrink like this, as they get out of the public square so as to tend to their private lives, and they have perfectly understandable reasons for doing that, the state is going to grow ever larger. And it's not going to grow like a despotic boot stomping on the face. It's going to take care of you, but in taking care of you, it's going to infantilize you. So Tocqueville is the first guy to describe what is sometimes called the nanny state. So this is one of his concerns. The other one that goes hand in hand with that, and this is less noticed, but it's there, is Tocqueville is worried about the rise of the commercial economy. In his time, it was the industrial economy. In our time, it'd be the commercial economy, the digital economy, which has something of the same force, right? If I'm somebody who works for a big business, whether it be a pin factory in the 19th century or Google now, I can't do the thing I know how to do and thereby make my way in the world without this huge organization. And so we become, in our economic lives, more and more dependent on this stuff in ways that are often really, really frustrating.
Yes.
And so, we employer-provided healthcare, something like this. Like, think about it. We can't, we have this great medical technology, but how can we access it Well, I can access it through two hugely frustrating alternatives: employer-based healthcare or state-based healthcare. And I'm going to have to spend a lot of time on the phone with bureaucrats, whichever one I choose. That's the frustration of modern life, right?
Yeah, I was going to say, so Tocqueville would come in with a little bit more of an "I told you so" or "I warned you about these things" attitude than just being horrified or surprised.
He would say that there's some of this stuff that I could have seen from the 19th century, but some of the stuff that you and I already talked about, he would point out to us that we have reasons for hope. And it's always despair is such an academic vice that I always want to point these things out. Tocqueville says, I wish statesmen would worry less about doing great things with men than with making great men. That is, with building up human beings is, I think, what he's really concerned with. And I think he would point out to us that there's lots that all of us can do, from the Ultimate Frisbee League to the school that my kids attend, which was founded by families, right? They didn't like the school, so they made a new one. We can do stuff like that. And by doing stuff like that, we become better people, more capable people. We get a better society. There is something to be said for citizenship in the active sense that would really help a lot of us. And so I think that's a practical thing Tocqueville thinks we could do.
Yeah, is fair to say that we expect too much out of our politics to solve all of our problems. And in many ways, Pascal would say, hey, your politics have become your religion and you're doing that wrong. Montaigne might say, hey, you're taking everything too seriously.
Yes.
It seems, social media takes everything too serious. Every day there's a new crisis. I quit social media, by the way, and I'm much happier for it.
Yeah, me too. It's
great. Yes, it's a better place on the other side. And Tocqueville would be like, well, yes, this will happen if you don't safeguard it, in a way.
Yeah, I think
we expect politics to solve slavery now or something, like these huge problems. It's become a religion. It's become everything that we fear. We didn't ask it to be in the first place, is what Tocqueville would say.
I think that's really good, and I think it's this juxtaposition between my own sense of existential smallness and the largeness of the forces that I feel myself to be dealing with, right? So you look at something like the global economy, and you say, what can I do about that? Although I'm very much subject to it, right? It's like if there are economic changes that may cause my job to cease to exist, well, that's a problem for me. And there seems to be very little that I can do about it. And so it's very natural to say, oh, well, I've just got to reach for the state because it's the only thing big enough to handle any of this. But as you point out, we have unreasonable expectations of what the state can do and do well. We also have unreasonable expectations of what big corporations can do and do well. We have unreasonably low expectations of what we can do and do well. And I think, a lot of the most important educational work to be done right now is through the cultivation of what the Georgetown political theorist Josh Mitchell calls liberal competence. We just need to learn to be competent again. It's a graduate school classmate of mine, a guy named Matt Crawford, wrote this wonderful book called Shop Class as Soulcraft.
Former guest of mine, and his recent book of Why We Drive is just phenomenally good as well. I don't know if you've read it yet. It's just tremendously good. Big fan of Tocqueville as well.
Yeah, Matt's a wonderful thinker, and his pointing out like learning to fix stuff, learning to make stuff, fixing stuff is really Matt's thing. That's really important, and it's more essential to the good life than we recognize. I think we just want to farm that out to the plumber and the electrician. We'd be happier if we knew how to do it ourselves.
Yeah, and I think he puts his finger on, not to turn it into a Matt Crawford part 2 episode for me, but he puts his finger on a lot of the anguish and anger that we feel, or that maybe we see from, not to pin it on politics now, but from a seemingly right-wing backlash to a lot of this, or conservative philosophy backlash, is the perceived hubris of the liberal philosophy, and armed with the modern tools of Silicon Valley, to kind of, as you said, steer the global economy in a way that it took a lot of those kinds of jobs, but tasks away out of our human hands. Something like, he talks very much about the taxi drivers and the knowledge in London, and Uber comes along and wipes them all out in the next day. And this may be more than just sort of an economic Luddite kind of pushback, but a real philosophical blunder that had gone unrecognized, uncared for, unnoticed, that Tocqueville would have been warning, like, hey guys, be careful with that, because we need that stuff somehow.
That's really good, Jay. I think the sense that people need to feel useful is really important. And I think, and secondly, I think our sense that we can actually replace the human beings who help us build a world together, that's another phrase of Mitchell's, the sense that we can actually replace them with machines is just grossly overstated. Everybody who owns a home knows that when you call a contractor, the contractor's in charge, because those guys, they're scarcer than we are. And and that's a real, so in other words, those kinds of skills are still very useful things. And we should honor them.
Yeah. So what are your closing thoughts on it for this whole endeavor you've done? I mean, I've loved just about everything you've said. You end with advice to a student, although I want you to just give advice more generally to what we talked about at the beginning, this sense of hollowness, emptiness. Where do we start? I mean, you have ideas like the Sabbath.
Right.
You could start there. You could start by starting a Frisbee team, which somehow we're now a big advocate of.
Right.
Yeah.
This is not what I was expecting when I got on this podcast. I think the way that we can think about this most usefully is to say, look, we start from a portrait of a student who's restless in this book. And she's restless because she doesn't know how to choose the various goods of her life. She could do lots of things. She has lots of options, but none of them seem to be compelling. One thing that we could do educationally is learn to rank the goods. That is, it is more possible to rationally prioritize the things we do with our time than I think we often understand. I think we feel like every decision we make has to be a kind of based on some kind of transcendental insight from the beyond, that comes to us in a very idiosyncratic way, as opposed to noticing that there are lots of old books that walk through the various goods that human beings tend to try to use to make themselves happy, and that we've tested out a lot of this stuff. And so, for example, I don't think money can make people happy, and I don't think that depends on who the people are. In other words, it's like, I think there's just a disproportion between the kind of thing money is and the kind of thing a human being is, such that the one can't possibly satisfy the other. So I think part of what we can do is just learn to use our reason again to think about the aims of human life. And I think by doing that, we can make our choices seem less arbitrary. The other thing along those lines is that I think we have too high an estimate of choice. We don't need to think like, if it's not a bolt from the blue that comes to my idiosyncratic soul, it's not authentically me, and therefore it's kind of fake. Taking what's given in life is also something that could be very helpful. That's a start on the educational point. There are lots of other things, obviously, that one could say.
If I was talking to these four thinkers and they were somehow guests on my podcast, I don't know if they could have foreseen. They could foresee analogs of everything we're dealing with, and that's what we're talking about. And that's the best philosophers can do. I could just guess the analogs, and these are very old existential questions. So of course they're going to resurface forever, in my estimation. I don't know what comes after social media and after a company like Amazon and after the kind of tools that we have and after the kind of AI that we are tinkering with now. But my concern would be, did any of you, if I could bring them all in time machines here, did any of you foresee the potency and power of the forces around us, either trying to distract us, trying to make our choices for us, and your last question about choice and about choice manipulation and social media platforms, about trying to divide us, did you foresee the potency of these things, even the potency of a very radically different answer than Tocqueville saw in China? Did you see the potency of a state like that being able to surveil everyone with this kind of technology? And is they talked a lot about human nature in a very esoteric sense. I'm almost talking about it in a sort of biological brain sense. Is this wetware and hardware that I have strong enough to resist this world and find the truths in all of the thinkers that we admire in the book? That's what I worry about.
Well, I think that's a really good question, and that one I don't know that I have an answer to. I would say a couple of things. One, as we go forward, we are going to try to understand some of these things. I think one of the things we've been thinking about with respect to how to formulate the next problem that we're going to work on is, why are there no liberals under 30? That is, why is it the case that there's so few people in the rising generation who have any appreciation, really, of the goods created by the classical liberal order? And we want to figure, I don't want to be too harsh on the young. I think their discontents are real and exist for a reason, and can actually be, in a strange way, reason for hope. Because things are not going that well in a lot of ways, and the discontents of young people are the energy that we're going to need to do something about that. Nonetheless, without great education, those energies can obviously go in some really destructive ways. So that's where we're going in thinking about these things. And with respect to your comment about our human wetware and hardware, which I really like, I think we should just despise it less. There's a great article by my teacher Leon Cass. Maybe it's at least probably 20 years old now, but it's called "Why Not Immortality?" It's a great summation of the reasons why our mortality, which all of us in a way naturally hate, is deeply connected to many of the things in life that we most profoundly value. And so without mortality, there would be no disease, perhaps one could say, but without mortality, there might also be no love. And is that really the kind of world that we would want? And so some respect for the hardware and wetware that we've been given might be really useful to us in being less quick. I think something that all of us notice, and I certainly notice, is the ease with which I give away little bits of control over my life, little bits of my mental space for the sake of a tiny bit of convenience. How often do I do that online? I think a higher valuation of the lives that we've been given could help us, at least, in resisting some of that tendency that all of us find in ourselves.
Yeah, that's perfect. If there's anything that I think your book and your work is doing is to push us to ask the big questions and really find value in them, to not think of it as just sort of philosophical navel gazing, but genuinely pragmatic, useful, life-changing quests for answers and knowledge. And yeah, my final sloppy sort of worries there are just about if we realize that is the gem at the center of what it means to be a human, well, then that just needs to be protected. And any kind of infringement on the ability to ask and answer and seek is a crime that we will not permit or give away willingly. I think that's the challenge. It's a huge challenge. I think we're at a really, really interesting precipice of, again, the potency of the dangers of all the things that these philosophers talked about have taken shape and root in our world in a very, very interesting and fast way that, I'm convinced we need at one time new philosophies, but as you're pointing out, to very old philosophies in order to navigate this now incredibly philosophically dangerous world where it's getting, with the Pinker graphs, less and less physically dangerous. And that's the dichotomy and the paradox that I don't know, we need to somehow figure out.
That's really helpful, Jay. I mean, I think you've been pushing me, and I really appreciate this, to say more of what I think about the here and now. I want to push back slightly for a moment and just remind people of something, an experience you've obviously had long before you had anything to do with our book, the experience of stepping outside of one's own time and place to spend some time in the company of a great mind from another time and place. It is immensely liberating, right? You go, it doesn't have to be the people, I love the people that we wrote about in this book, but there are lots of these people. You go and you see that human souls of the highest order have been struggling with many of the same problems that we have right now for a very long time. And while there are few, if any, perfect answers to anything to be found out there, we can learn an awful lot from our fellow strugglers along this road. in particular with respect to just not taking all the things we're experiencing to be more unprecedented than they are. There surely are things right now that are unprecedented, but there are a lot of things that have analogs in other times and places, and it can be something of a comfort just to know that those analogs exist.
Yeah, absolutely. It was very well said, and it could also come from the fiction world, not the non-fiction world. My first encounter with that thinker is Kurt Vonnegut, the first writer and thinker that made me feel less alone and seen and being like, oh, wow, other people are asking these things and doing it in a very different way than Pascal. And for you, your homework is the Coen brothers and the Big Lebowski is a fiction thinkers and things that is your book in many ways. I think you'll love it. Is your book in many ways set in a very farcical Coen brothers only way. Anyway, this was incredible. I honestly just love the book, like I said. And it's not long. It's less than 200 pages, and I always appreciate people writing succinctly, really dense stuff to get it down to 200 pages. It's called Why We Are Restless, and go get it. And you wrote this along with your wife. Doing a creative endeavor like this with a romantic partner and not ending in divorce is also means for congratulations. How you did it is wonderful, I guess, and the Sabbath must be working. So congratulations to both of you.
Well, thanks very much. And as to our ability to co-author, well, my wife is a wonderful person. So there we are.
Enough said. This was incredible. Thank you so much, Benjamin Storey. Amazing.
Thanks, Jay.